324 years have passed since the founding of the WOC, and the world is much changed. For most of its existence, the West Odresh Company has been a monumental failure. Such a long way from the homeland, and with such a treacherous journey to bring supplies and colonists to the fledgling settlements en masse, the company has been spending ludicrous amounts to simply sustain its colonies. In the meantime, however, the Home Isles have been united for the first time under a single man, King Edward the Magnanimous. And this new and glorious era, the newly founded Kingdom of Frostock, has emerged as the first great power. Like King Bartholomew I of Burnlund far before him, Edward realizes the great potential of the overseas colonies. However, Bartholomew never saw the fruits of his labors, as the colonies were only able to export some exotic perishables and furs when the winds were right. Instead, the western colonies grew slowly, and with immense cost. Whilst not bringing much in the way of income for the homeland, the colonies have begun to develop their own distinct identity, forming in their churches, marketplaces, farms, and taverns. We arrive now in the year 49 ante-Laurentium. Though slow, the colonial settlements we once knew as ramshackle settlements have turned into thriving centers of commerce in their own right. Growing beyond their original palisades, the colonists have begun to work the land in more efficient and profitable plantations, farms, and lumber yards. As Edward the Magnanimous seeks to properly establish a foothold in western Odresh, however, he must first, finally, establish his power over the region. With a now healthy population, the military presence on Auckton Island has grown massively. The natives, despite their renaissance, have not been able to keep up, as military developments back in the homeland are quickly shipped over, an attempt to start a quick and decisive conflict to settle who controls the Straits once and for all. It is clear that the natives are outmatched. Yet, the Elynthi peoples have resolved to make a final stand, beginning the Elynthi Bush War. As every tribe from the region pours men onto Auckton Island, the Elynthi people will not go down without fight, leading up to the greatest confrontation yet seen in the Western Hemisphere, the Battle of Southvale. This is where we begin. Welcome to Auckton. Heyo folks, welcome back to another episode. Glad to be back on schedule this time. Luckily my university stuff has calmed down a little bit. So this episode is very different than the previous ones because we're starting off with a major time skip. About 300 years have passed since the last episode. And as you can see here in the background, a lot of the cities have developed considerably. I've downloaded a bunch of new assets, mostly these kind of half-timber homes, in order to kind of show the technological and industrial progression of these colonies. I'm starting off this episode here with dragging over a bunch of houses and starting a new neighborhood. A lot of this was cut out because it's nothing new, per se, but I figured it was still worth showing, simply because I wanted to show off the progression of the settlements. You can see in the background that a lot of the farms have actually been replaced. They are now functional industry buildings, and you can see there at the bottom we actually have a positive profit margin, along with a massive population boom. This is lore-wise in part because of a bunch of settlers coming over time, native population growth, all that good stuff. But game-wise, I just adjusted the population of a lot of these buildings. After placing down a lot of these kind of denser shops and houses, the wall-to-wall kind of stuff, I noticed how low the population still was, and I noticed that only like one household was being housed in any one of those larger houses. So I went through and adjusted the RICO settings in order to, or the realistic population settings, excuse me, to basically shove more people into these houses. You can see here in game, I'm just going through and detailing this neighborhood as I always do. I throw down a bunch of dirt decals to dirty everything up, along with fences and trees to show off property and all that good stuff. But yeah, in terms of housing and standard of living, a lot of people were just kind of shoved into these bunk houses. Of course, people obviously had their own houses, still homesteads and whatnot. A lot of these smaller houses you see, like the ones that I'm working on now, are of course single family still. But in the denser areas where artisans and shopkeepers and stuff like that would work, it's not uncommon to have very small square footage to house an entire family. Uh, but yeah, you saw there earlier, you got a glimpse, I actually placed a new bridge. I figured commerce between the farms of Southvale and the other settlements would be important enough where they would invest in finally, a major bridge over the river. This will be most likely the only bridge for a long, long time over the river. But now, finally, in the time skip, these settlements are connected. You see here I'm dragging out a road out into this wilderness, and unlike before, this is not for a new town. With the new interconnectivity between all of the settlements, this will actually become a lumber area. Houses, of course, were mostly made of wood back then. Not much masonry except in the larger areas. Masonry was usually reserved for fortifications for the most part. It was simply cheaper for peasants to chop down some trees to build their house instead of buying stuff from a quarry. So having a sustainable, well, not necessarily sustainable, nothing back then was sustainable, but having a lumber yard for growing and selling trees would be a pretty major business, especially with all of the house construction going on. Unfortunately, the vanilla asset for the forestry building, it's quite large. I tried for some time to figure out how to cover it up, to replace it with one of the assets I already have, to make it a little more period appropriate, but I never could, so I just had to settle with just plopping one of those little barn props over the if you hear a train, I am so sorry. I live right by a railroad track. But yeah, I just put a little barn over the container props, and we're just gonna have to deal with that log cabin, which isn't entirely period inappropriate, except that there's an air conditioner unit on the side. But don't look closely; you'll never notice it. But yeah, I'm just placing down these tree plantations, making sure they all look like they can exist. I struggled with some time to figure out how to blend this into the forest. Never did get a solid idea on how to do that. I'm sure there are mods, but I'm not aware of any at the moment. So I just kind of, instead of just placing a crap load of trees on top, I simply just remove the ones there. That way they're not conflicting with one another, two different styles. It would look a little weird. And I just go back and place a few more trees around to make it look, well, if I can't make it look natural, then I'm going to make it intentionally artificial. So it's very clearly defined where the natural old growth trees stop and these plantation trees begin. But yeah, that's more or less this industry area done. I don't want to do any of the heavy industry stuff yet. That'll probably come much later once we arrive in the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. So the next thing I did was I grabbed these docks and I extended out the ports of Southvale and New Lockport quite substantially. This is the Southvale port that we're working on right now. These aren't functional, they're simply for decoration, of course, but I feel that it provides a lot of detail for not much effort, simply to kind of activate the coastline to, I don't know, make it look a bit more developed, if that makes sense. Over here, this is pretty special actually. I didn't realize it at the time until later I realized what I did. but we're currently seeing me working on expanding out the port of New Lockport. And in order to do that, I had to get rid of the palisade wall. This means for the first time, a settlement has decided to get rid of its palisades in order to properly expand out. Uh, I'm not sure necessarily of the history of when settlements began abandoning palisade walls. Of course, they provide pretty good defense for how cheap they are. It's difficult to scale over them because you can wind up impaling yourself on the logs. But yeah, so this is a pretty significant moment, all things considered, for New Lockport, because it means for the first time they feel confident enough that they are secure enough to not worry about locking everything behind the palisade. Of course, they keep some of it. You can see there on behind the screen now, but they keep some of it simply because, yeah, it does provide defense, and the more defense you have, the better. But yeah, I'm just fixing up the terrain there right in front of the port by adding a couple roads, activating the waterfront a little bit, and then I grab these props and begin detailing a little bit. I'm not a super big detailer. I do love how detailing looks once you're done, but the entire process is just a little tedious sometimes. So, like before, I use these little barn props to hide I guess the dirty little secrets of that I wasn't able to correctly line up these docks together to make a perfect angle. So the barns cover the little, I guess, spaces that the docks themselves can't line up and take up. And then I use these little shelters as places where dock workers would stack crates and all that good stuff in order to keep them out of the weather. And then just to add a little bit more detail, I throw in these fishing docks. It takes me a moment to figure out where the docks are. I believe these are actually fish farms. Yep. So I quickly get rid of that, and then yeah, just replace them with normal fishing docks. So now that I've got the proper docks, I lower them into the ground a little bit just to hide a lot of the actual woodwork under the ploppable prop docks. These all are going to be functional. Each and every one of them will be producing fish. So once I figure out the height it needs to be and where I want them, I quickly drag each of them out and swap out the boats that they spawn. Then I begin dragging out the fishing paths that the boats will take, and very, very carefully I was able to actually maneuver it under this bridge. That way they can... Well, one, this river is actually apparently extremely salmon-rich. I'm not entirely sure how accurate that is to real life. This region is loosely based on Louisiana, or Georgia, of course, but granted, a lot more mountainous. But yeah, so salmon fishing in what is practically the Mississippi River. But yeah, what I was very proud of is I just so happened to manage to have the bridge high enough and maneuver the fishing paths just correctly to where the fishing boats actually pass perfectly under the bridge. But yeah, now with the new docks in place, I try my best to, well, one, make that road make sense. It's very steep, definitely wouldn't pass today. But yeah, I get rid of a couple of the smaller houses out by the port side and begin to grab and place over these denser buildings. These docks would be great hubs of activity for any kind of commercial areas, and with a lot of commercial areas comes denser residential, because back in these times, they didn't have any sort of public transit, they didn't really have cars. Of course, the game takes liberties with that, so everybody and their grandmother has a horse. But, yeah, so having these sorts of mixed use, dense areas were quite common back then. Uh, oh, if only we could achieve what, our ancestors were once capable of doing. So yeah, I just quickly kind of densify the dock side by dragging over these larger buildings. I also, where the palisade walls were, I replaced the walls themselves, or where the walls used to be, with these denser buildings as well, to signify that the prosperity and commercial districts of New Lockport have expanded quite significantly, and that, you know, again, it's pretty a pretty big moment when they decide to undertake this sort of redevelopment campaign. So yeah, I'm just copying over a bunch of these little houses in order to just densify New Lockport as much as possible. The terrain here is, of course, extremely challenging, but it's something I really do enjoy working with. I feel like it makes the city a lot more realistic by working with the terrain instead of flattening everything. But just copying around these little trees just to make the environment a little more nicer to look at and probably nicer to live in. But you can see the town square there with the old town square with the terrain like it is. I am sure that walking from one side of town to the other in order to just get a bucket of water would be absolute not a fun time. But you see here, I come out into this random patch of forest and start putting down dirt. And this is going to be the main focus of the rest of this episode and the main point of the entire episode itself. So I start by just placing down that dirt and clearing away the trees in order for me to have a nice pad to start detailing and working with. This is going to be the site of the Battle of Southvale, which is going to be, or which is by far the largest battle and the final battle of the Elynthi Bush War. Uh, so battles back in this time period were fought far differently than in our time. In modern times, we're used to hearing about small groups of soldiers carrying out specialized missions, or front-style warfare like you see in Ukraine, where both sides are entrenched and are attempting to break the other side in order to get through. Um, However, back then, oftentimes commanders would be in some sort of limited communication with one another and would opt to meet one another in open fields of battle. Of course, some commanders, and oftentimes the most historically known commanders, broke this convention and would engage the enemy whenever they felt like it, whenever they felt like they had the biggest upper hand. For example, many battles in the Civil War were fought in the open field style, where soldiers simply just met each other in open fields. Both usually had fortifications already prepared to meet the other. But George Washington, of course, is well known for crossing the Delaware in the middle of the night in order to get the jump on the British. Uh, so I start here with these large battlements. In a perfect world, these would be made of earthworks, but I simply didn't want to go to the workshop and close out the game and, do the whole process. Those battlements are to station cannons on top of, the cannons being covered with those little roofs in order to protect them from the elements. There's also a few other cannons stationed in the middle of the battlefield for just additional support. But here I begin working on the temporary fort itself. So I grab over these barracks buildings from the fort in Southvale. And earlier I also copied over a bunch of soldiers for me to work with later in order to detail everything up. Of course, because this is City Skylines, everything gets really pissed off at me when I don't connect it up to water and power, so I just get into that and do that immediately. Um, Naturally, I don't think that these, like, what is that, 8 barracks would be sufficient to house all of the soldiers that will be on the battlefield for the colonial side, but I didn't feel like building an entire city for a temporary, camp. I then tried to find a guard tower. Of course, we have the larger guard towers around the colonial settlements, and I do wind up using those. But I do feel like they're a bit too big, a little too permanent looking for what is ultimately a temporary camp that's meant to be disassembled and moved at a moment's notice. But with the guard towers in place, and with me not wanting to go into the workshop, um, I simply place them down and begin these palisade walls. Yeah. So the next step in this is actually working on the detail work, and probably one of the first times I've done proper detailing in this series. So I copy over one of the uh, like general's guards, or like general commanders, if that makes sense. I'm not sure what like the rank would be. I'm sure it would be something like lieutenant or colonel or something like that. But yeah, these commanders watch over both the artillery, and also give general orders down to the field below. I also station the general and his like advisors and closest officers near the mouth of the camp in order to give him a good vantage point of the battlefield itself. Of course, the general wouldn't be fighting in the battle himself. No, that's far too dangerous. Better to watch from the sidelines and let the soldiers do the work. But yeah, now that the general is in place, and you see here the regiment commanders standing in the middle of the field, ready to command their troops once I place them down later, I go through and add the troops around the cannons and begin the labor-intensive task of placing down all of the soldiers. Just kidding. I actually use Move It. Move It is so incredibly helpful for stuff like this. Once I just place down a small group, I can then copy that and make a larger group, and then copy the larger group, and then place that around. And it's great. Love Move It. If you get any mod for City Skylines, get Move It. It changes the game entirely. But yeah, I'm just continuing to place down the troops. So, with the natives needing, of course, to score a victory here, because a loss would mean subjugation under the colonial administration, why aren't the natives just engaging in guerrilla tactics? Of course, the natives probably have already engaged in guerrilla tactics, wearing down the colonial forces, but with the style of battle going on, and how the natives have attempted to do their best to adopt sort of these old world Turlin in this universe practices, I imagine that knowing with their numbers advantage that the colonials would be willing to go into a face-to-face confrontation in a Turlin style. I feel like they might take it in the hopes that they can just soundly defeat the Turlins using their sheer numbers advantage. It's off screen now, but you can see that I've already placed down every colonial troop that I want to place down, and their line is not very thick. However, in the Elynthi Bush War, this isn't just a couple of tribes on Auckton Island. This is every Ellidir tribe united in what's called the Elynthi Confederation. So yeah, there are hundreds and hundreds of people from these tribes, all here in order to support the offensive and to support their own sovereignty over these lands. So you can see I placed down hundreds of these guys and several of these little groups of men in the back line as groups of commanders. Instead of one unified general, I figure the natives, with their more communal lifestyle, would have several groups of commanders in order to make command decisions quickly. I also station here, or I grab one of their formations and I station them back in these trees. There's a few of these. I imagine these would either be archers or simply just reserves for the battlefield. So, in general, the Elynthi Confederation seem more organized in terms of their actual troops, and they have the numbers advantage. But unfortunately, what they lack is the technology. So, as I complete the battlefield there, I'm going to leave you with these cinematics. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and comment any feedback you'd like me to hear, and please come back next week to figure out the conclusion of the Elynthi Bush War and what happens in Auckton next.